You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast in association with exerciseprescriber.com, and this is session 54. Welcome back to Physio Matters. I'm Jack Chew, and thank you so much for all the feedback for episode 53 with Adrian McGregor, a discussion with one of our patients. What a spectacular character. And so thanking him so much for coming on the show. Takes a lot, and it's really good of him to share his story. I know that he's benefiting lots of people. We're getting lots of emails through from patients and therapists and policymakers. It's touched a lot of lives as that one, and we do get a lot of feedback through behind the scenes as well as on social media, but on this one it's been particularly noisy, and rightly so. So he's really changing minds and had an incredible story that we can all learn from. So thank you to Adrian. Thank you to you lot for getting in touch, and I hope if you haven't listened to that one yet, then just pause this now, catch up, please. It's important, and it feeds into this one as well, because this is a very different level of analysis. But more of that later. So, Reforming MSK Practice Conference, Museum of Science and Industry, 5th and 6th of October. Ticket sales going well. And if you're planning on coming, then please do make sure you get your ticket booked, www.reform.physio/conference, and get that signed up, because I'd hate for you to miss out. We've had lots of inquiries and emails, but we're about to ramp up the noise. We're going to start bringing out the material that we recorded from the last event and a lot of the promo stuff for the conference, including our bumper lineup, and start to inform you a little more about the program, which is going to be rather innovative, but we would say that, wouldn't we? But yeah, definitely don't want you missing out on that. Keep an eye out for a competition to win a free full conference ticket, including the big Friday night party. This will be a social media competition, so get on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram to maximise your chances. I think it will be an entertaining one too, so you will be amused at that. So even if you can't make it, then you certainly want to be keeping an eye out for that, and hopefully sharing the wealth and spreading the word about that event. Lots of questions coming through on email about group bookings, because I think some entire departments are coming along, even groups of students flying in from Europe for a Manchester weekender. So here's an extra deal. Because we're very green at Choose Health, if you fill a car with you and 4 friends, then you'll get 2 free #TheBigRs party tickets and drinks vouchers from me. And this can all be booked separately if you want. And you've just got to let us know via info@reform.physio, and make sure your mates name you in the booking, and then you're saving £100 on that. So that would be well worth your while if a few of you are coming, and thank you for those of you that chase me on email probing for that. If you ask, you will get. Anyway, I'm so excited about the conference. I could keep talking and reeling off ideas, but I'm also excited to bring you today's podcast, which is with Lesley Holdsworth. Lesley is one of my favourite trailblazers in the profession and a huge inspiration to me, as you'll kind of hear in this interview. She has had an incredibly colourful career, which can be read about on her website, lesleyholdsworth.com. And you can find her speaking on our live streams of #TheBigRs 2.0 event on Facebook, where she shook up even our crowd of skeptics, which was really impressive. I think you're going to love this one, so I will shut up and see you at the other side. So I bring you Dr. Lesley Holdsworth. Okay, so I'm delighted to be here today with Lesley Holdsworth, who a lot of you will have already heard of, especially in recent times. Lesley's kindly spoken at our Big R's events and contributed to those and supported them. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that, but also about our interesting career journey so far, from the shop floor and front line through to positions of influencing policy at the very highest level. So really interesting story. Without me butchering an introduction, I'm going to allow her to introduce herself. But firstly, thank you so much, Lesley, for coming on the show and for sharing your thoughts with us and our listeners today.
No, it's my privilege. Thank you very much for inviting me.
No problem. So can we start off with what you're currently doing, and just introduce yourself to the listeners more generally?
Well, hello everybody. As Jack has said, I'm Lesley Holdsworth. I live and work in Scotland, where I've been since the early 80s, despite my accent. So that's where my sphere of experience principally has been. I have strayed into the rest of the UK and other countries over that that time, but Scotland has been my focus. My present role is I work for Scottish Government, and where I'm the clinical lead for digital health and care. I'm one person together with 4 colleagues who are all doctors. So I hope I'm sort of really shouting the flag for the other professions. But obviously I am a physio by background. So, that's where my heart lies. So that's my role at the moment.
Fantastic. So that's where you're at the moment, but there's a colourful story beneath it. So can we do a whistle-stop tour of your story so far, if you don't mind?
I trained in Sheffield. I am a physio, as we said. And then I went to work in various places clinically, ending up some 8 years later in Scotland, where I worked clinically for a couple of years. But then I suddenly started to get interested in how we deliver services and making things better, etc. So that led me into various different kinds of roles in either research or in, I had the first ever non-medical computing fellowship in Scotland, because I was interested in information and how we could use information to improve what it is we were doing. Then from then on, I went into wider roles about improving services. So improvement has been sort of the driving mantra all the way through my career. Most recently, for the last decade, I think, with the exception of my current role, I should say, is I was head of health services research and effectiveness for Scotland, and that was for all professions. So I headed up the teams of the health services researchers, statisticians, health economists, people who are doing audit, etc., lots of other national inquiries, etc. So my experience is quite broad brush, I think, particularly since the probably about 2004. But at the heart of that, I've always maintained strong professional links with my professional organisation. And I think possibly physiotherapists know me best as the work that I've been doing since the early 90s around trying to explore the efficacy for self-referral to physio, first contact practice, etc. So together with a great colleague of mine, Val Webster, we did the seminal work, undertook a national trial, then took it internationally and worked with WCPT and international bodies looking at this whole issue about self-referral to physio. And then I suppose the other sort of key area that's of direct relevance to this conversation was in 2010, I was approached by an organisation in Scotland called NHS24, which is our primary out-of-hours provider here. And as you can imagine, out of hours, we have a whole platform of technologies that are really busy in the evenings and at weekends, but during the daytime they have normally sort of quite sort of asleep, really. So we wanted to look at whether we could start to develop the use of this fabulous technological platform for other purposes during the sort of the 9 to 5 hours. So MSK problems and issues were really big on our political agenda. Long waiting times, etc. I'm sure everybody knows these kind of stories, and actually really quite problems for patients to access reliable information, accurate triaging, etc., etc. So I was approached to see whether, given my previous interest in improving access to patients through self-referral, whether we could take this a little bit further and expand it into the technological world. So we did that, and we developed and trialed and evaluated a national platform which actually works through the telephone and a series of sort of software, etc. And we also developed a national platform for a range of resources which are available in various formats, including through digital TVs, apps, websites, etc. So we've got, in Scotland, we have a consistent and high quality resource that is available to everyone. And in fact, we know that this is used internationally quite a lot as well. So I was really interested to see whether we could actually push the boundaries in terms of musculoskeletal services. And when I say musculoskeletal services, yes, physios are at the core of that, but it wasn't just a physio service. We had other people, we had medics, we had podiatrists, for example, we had occupational health folk who are really interested in this as a concept. But the basis was putting ourselves in the shoes of a service user. So what did they want? How did they want to access services? So that was really interesting couple of years for me. But my job was always to develop and evaluate it and then stand back and go back to my day job. And I'm pleased to say that that service has gone from strength to strength. And now takes calls from many hundreds of thousands of people every year, and the resources are downloaded or utilised by millions. So, I'm delighted to see what a success that has been, but it wasn't an easy sell, I can tell you. So I'm quite used to controversy from various people, including my own profession, but that's what life's all about, pushing boundaries.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly going to talk on some of those stories. One of the things I just wanted to ask after then is how, because there's been some if I've read it right, there's a consistency almost of the fact that you and colleagues will come up with ideas or be hearing noise from the front line, both in terms of staff and patient needs, as to we want things to be different, and then from that a process emerges, some of which controversial. But I'm just interested in what is it that. Do you feel there's any consistency there? Can you tell me a little bit about how these things emerge? Do you find that these are just problems to be solved that you see, and then they only scale up as much as they have done, and your roles have therefore scaled up and things because that's the level that is required to see it through to its conclusion? Or are you always a big systems thinker and always have been, and that's not necessarily emerged, that's almost as you have done by design? So I'm just wondered what if you can try and clarify to me a little bit about why these things seem to consistently be on a big level for you.
They haven't always been that way, without a doubt, and a good example of that, the first time I really got involved in that made me think about, actually, we should be able to do this better, was way back, and I hope this doesn't happen anymore anywhere. Patients who came to physio were assigned a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or a Tuesday, Thursday, and for no other reason than just the order they came in through the door. There was no rhyme and reason to it, and we had a group of little old ladies with fractured humeruses who would come Monday, Wednesday, Friday religiously, or Tuesdays and Thursdays for 6 weeks, and be put on all sorts of regimes. And there was never really any thinking behind that. So that was the first thing that I thought, this can't be right, or we need to look at this. So I think that in terms of our own responsibilities, I think of myself as a professional. But as any professional has a responsibility to always be pushing boundaries, to think about how can we make things better, to be looking for opportunities. So opportunities can arise at every stage, and just don't have to be big systems level. And the majority of my work originally was not big systems level. It was initiated by just seeing something and just actually thinking, this can't be the best we can do for our patients. We must be able to do better than this. And obviously then I started in that kind of way, and looking at sort of local services, and then because of some political changes that went on in the 90s, and where the sphere of influence about who was purchasing rehab services, etc., it became very clear to me very quickly that we needed to be really savvy about, if people are going to buy our services, then we had to be able to demonstrate our impact and prove how we could make their lives easy for them. So I suppose my thinking was scaling up and up, but it was definitely an evolution, and happened over periods of years. And then the last 15 years or something, then I've been focused nationally. So definitely, maybe a bit of a big thing, blue sky thinker or whatever now, but I think it was driven by seeing that clinical need and the needs of the people that we were providing services to.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I think we'll probably touch on some of the detail on that as the chat goes on. I mean, my first MSK job was in an early adopting self referral service in Nottingham, and then as someone who had an interest in digital tech and implementation from early doors, that was just sort of what got my juices flowing even back then. I noticed your name cropped up whenever there was a service level innovation that was being trialled, be that self referral, be that telehealth, or what was then telephone triage. There was always that seemed to be something they'd be attached to. Now, I just want to try and find a way to make that into a question and say, is that a coincidence or is that a habit of yours? Are you famed for trailblazing by accident, or is that something that's just a natural thing that you've become because that's so tethered to you as a person?
Yeah, I think probably, as I say, I think it's evolved. But I think that I have a natural instinct to actually look at things. I'm not very good. I don't feel that it is professionally responsible to just sit back and take the status quo and do things as they always have done. And actually, at the end of the day, we are here, courtesy of the taxpayer. I'm talking about in the NHS services, courtesy of the taxpayer, and also all the citizens of our countries that we are here to provide services to. And if you see life changing in other spheres, in how we all live our lives, why should that be any different than in the health and care sector? So I'm happy to be called a disruptive innovator if people feel comfortable with that kind of terminology. It doesn't bother me at all. I just think it's my responsibility, as I say, as a professional, to always be, one eye to the future and making things better. And access to services is one of the completely disenabling or disempowering issue for many people, and it has so many bad knock-on effects for wider society, for employment, for how people live their lives, for how dependent they are on drugs, their whole behaviours. And I think at the nub of that, if we can get people, timely access to the right information and help, and primarily self-management resources, even in the first instance, even if they need to see a clinician, then that's been my driving sort of raison d'etre over the years, really.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I'd be a massive hypocrite if I was to try to even challenge that, because that's something that I've ended up becoming myself and being disruptive. Now, I therefore find it easy to. It's not hard for me to play devil's advocate on that, because I can just think of all the things that have been thrown at me in my much shorter career, and probably done so far more clumsily than you did. But generally speaking, I know what I'm called and what is suggested. Now, the obvious one is innovative disruption, but is that disruption for disruption's sake? What do you feel are the lines between doing it for that pursuit of progress, as you've described it, and then just being seen as someone that's just rocking the boat for effect? And where do you feel those lines are, if they exist?
Well, that's an interesting question, Jack, because I think we can all think of people who are just disruptive for disruptive sake, as it were. But to me, the fundamental difference is improvement always requires change. So if this is what we're talking about, and I think that's the fundamental nub of all this, is improving things. So if we're going to improve anything, it will always require people to change in some way, but it's not change for change's sake. And I think there's a fundamental difference. And it's about attitude. It's about being open, and as I say, open to the opportunity or the potential. And we need to be all change agents, I think, is one of the sort of buzzwords at the moment. But we just have to embrace it all and be happy to take on that kind of role, despite whatever you think. And I have, as I say, I've courted quite a lot of controversy over my life, or lifetime career. Firstly, in terms of self-referral, you wouldn't believe how many physios were totally against that in an NHS setting. And, even when I introduced the services at NHS 24, the national platform, I was virtually hauled down to London to explain myself, etc. Because people are very protectionist about traditional approaches. So, people need to be open to what needs to change. and it's not just change for change's sake. And I certainly do not advocate change for change's sake. We've got enough change in our life without introducing that level. So it has to be positive disruption.
And I mean, there's going to be lots of factors affecting those sorts of pushbacks, and again, I've encountered plenty myself. But is that a generalised distrust of competition, for want of a better term, or that there's an established order of doing things, and then something disrupts that, and there's a distrust of almost the idea marketplace, if we call it that they're not fans of? What do you feel is driving that protectionism, I guess?
I think it's slightly different within the NHS than it is probably in the private sector, just simply because that's how the systems work. However, I think the reason that people are resistant to change can be multifactorial. Lack of confidence, just quite happy with doing the 9 to 5, etc., etc. But then I think some of the resistance I've encountered over the years has been primarily around myths or myths, and I've been having to dispel lots of myths around job security even, which I could never understand that one, because there's more than enough work for physios in this country, and particularly in Scotland, where we still have people waiting far longer than they need to be waiting for, and need to be seen by really highly skilled and motivated physios here. So I think people develop stances for lots of different reasons, personal, professional, or whatever. And it's just trying to sort of try and break down all of those barriers bit by bit. And it can feel like trying to eat an elephant whole at times. But, it has to be done, and you just develop a thick skin to it. And so long as you go about it in a logical and very calm and very, when I say calculated, I mean in terms of you've thought through what your methodology is, you've thought through what the issues are, and you've thought through potentially what the objections are, and you can make a coherent case for what it is you're doing, then I think, again, it comes back to all the time is the responsibilities on us. If we want to be called professionals, then we have to step up and act in a professional manner.
Yeah, for sure, and I think that's something that we've got to make sure that there's a thoroughness and a multifaceted sort of approach to when we're doing something or proposing something in a disruptive manner, is that it isn't then haphazard and therefore easy to dismiss. I think one of the things that I've reflected on a lot recently is that there's this almost go-to strategy, I want to call it, although it comes from a good place sometimes, it doesn't from others, where it's suggested that it's the messaging rather than the message that is the issue. So people infer that I don't think there's a problem with the core premise, but actually the way it's being delivered is not in the right order or of the right stance or of the right tone. Now, some of the time, of course, I've come to reflect and realise that, okay, yeah, that could have been improved upon. Whereas other times, despite the messaging being 3 or 4 different ways as advised, then at the end, that when it comes to the rub, whilst that improvement in messaging has sometimes strengthened the cause, say, with a core demographic for us, that would be that clinicians and people that come to support our work, it sort of it only seems to improve that you've got 3 different ways that you've said the same thing. However, when it comes to the people that were calling for the messaging to be better, it turns out that was just a strategy they were using, either to try to take up resources, take up time, or just hoping that you gave up, because actually when push comes to shove, you nail them down on it and they didn't like the original premise. Now, whilst I'm projecting a little bit here, but I don't know if that's something that you recognise, and whether you have any tips and tricks as to how people can stop being burnt out when they're innovating what they feel is in a sensible direction, and potentially being stifled by that style of, dare I say, bureaucracy that can sometimes just really stifle an idea. So again, feel free to push it back if you don't recognise that, but that's certainly been my experience.
Oh, I totally concur with that. I can recollect many a situation where that's definitely been my experience as well. And I think inherently, and I think this issue about messaging and the original premise is quite a critical one. Messaging and the language and the format and the type of engagement that we use, without a doubt, has a massive impact on how messages are received for the majority. But I think there's always, hopefully, a minority where they really don't want to hear that message at all, and it falls back to the original premise that we're talking about. Now, in my experience, that the world is full of early adopters, and equally who are at one end of the spectrum. Then you've got laggards right at the other end of the spectrum, and then you've got this sort of the majority who probably sit in somewhere between those levels. And the key to all of this is to have your early adopters actually influencing those that are sitting, rubbing shoulders with them. And what you're aiming for is to gain that tipping point. And it is hard work, and sometimes it's going back and back and back to people. It's developing your local champions, you're getting people all on board, and it's never easy. I don't think people, as I say, people just inherently do not like change, and particularly if they're comfortable where they are. If you're talking about sort of pulling the rug or jiggling the rug underneath their feet a bit, they don't like it. And it's quite natural. As I say, it's a natural human instinct that is. So there has to be some sort of benefit associated with this. So I found and particularly in the early days when we did work around self-referral, that I grew my own strength, if you like, and my own skin from surrounding myself with people who thought similarly, and people who are often referred to in some circles these days as critical friends, and not just limiting those to my immediate physio colleagues, because when push comes to shove, when we're talking about influence and actually moving agenda forward, then it's the wider voice that actually has an enormous influence over this. So, many of my critical friends were people like medics and GPs, other professionals, but even some of our managers, etc., trying to really get over the rationale for why this change could potentially benefit them and the patients, etc. So that we sort of try to grow a mass of those that actually have enough interest in that topic to really stop you getting to the stage where you feel this isn't worth the effort, it's just too hard. And when you're getting continual pushback. But, it's not easy. It does require a lot of doggedness and as I said before, a really thick skin. But, if you can see it through, then, you come out the other end of that. But I suppose as a person, me and myself, I'm not frightened by concepts or trying things out. I'm not particularly risk averse. I'm a calculated risk taker. I would never do anything to endanger people per se, but equally so, I'm more than happy to push the boundaries of models of service delivery and try them out. And if they're not right, then that's fine. We just go back to the drawing board again and look at that. I wasn't advocating for a certain way of doing things at all. I was just trying to appeal to people to say, let's try it. If it doesn't work, that's fine. If it does, look at the potential benefits that we could realise.
Yeah, for sure. No, that makes sense. Now let's zoom in a little bit on some of these instead of just keep alluding to them. What these controversies that you particularly speak of? If we zoom in on a couple of those as examples, then what were the processes and concepts and systems that you looked to change, and why? Just if we can talk a little bit about why they ended up even being controversial, because amusingly, they're things that we look back on now and champion them without giving thought to, because they seem, common sense isn't common until it's common. So can we zoom in a little bit on that and talk us through, and even how, if you can put it onto a timeline, that'd be useful as well.
Good. Okay, I can think of two really good examples, both to do with MSK services predominantly, but not exclusively, which is also useful to hopefully some of these listeners might then relate to more easily. Way back when we started looking at the efficacy of self-referral, Interestingly enough, the people who were the most resistant were physios themselves, not the managers, the medics, the patients, or anybody else. It was the physios, and predominantly physio managers. Not, I'm generalising here because we had some wonderful supporters. Don't get me wrong, but the most consistent resistance came from physio managers who were under the assumption that the buses would turn up if you allowed people to self-refer. And even though in our pilot work we'd been able to establish very clearly that in our pilot areas that had not been the case, but the resistance there was phenomenal. So to the extent that we couldn't get any funding to do a national trial because the physios said it wasn't a physio issue, it was something that we should get funding from. It wasn't a professional issue. We need to get funding from another funding body. The funding body actually felt that it was a professional issue. So we went round in circles, and I'm sure that was just a divergent tactic. So in the end, Valerie and I just did the work ourselves and sold ourselves at conferences to raise money for the odd fees. And we appealed to those that were keen to find out and said, well, let's see if the buses turn up. Let's just see. And interestingly enough, they didn't. We were very grateful that throughout the country, there were at least 2 sites in every of the 14 regions we have in Scotland who were willing to come along with us on this journey and just put a toe in the water. And actually from that, we were able to establish what the normal referral rates are to physio in various settings, i.e. geographical settings and socio-economical settings, which had never been done before. And in fact, we didn't get an increase in referrals. But rather than people saying, well, that's an interesting concept, let's test it out. In your piloting, you've not found that. They just weren't, they put their hands over their ears and that was it. They were just, really sort of unsure of that. And even when after we published all the evidence, and we went into Europe and did more European work and published that, I still heard people saying that. It's just people will just hear what they want to hear in spite of all the best evidence, sometimes. So that was a really good example, I think, of that. The second area that was possibly even more controversial was the digital platform development more recently within NHS 24. And that had people, physiotherapists again, nobody else, everybody else could see the logic of the thought process and the willingness to come along with us to actually test this out as well. We were never, mandating a national system. We were never forcing things on people. We were very clear about that. But despite that, people were very, very reluctant to even be open to the consideration of this as an option. So one of the first things I did, because I knew that one of the biggest areas of resistance would be around funding and people's concerns about this. So I initiated a lady who I consider to be one of the best health economists in the UK, to actually undertake a cost-benefit analysis of, well, let's see, because I think that a lot of really good services don't even get off the ground because you can't make the business case in terms of the money. So if the money doesn't stack up from the outset, you've got no chance really. And I was fully aware of that because the service did cost money to set up at NHS 24 and it costs money to run. So who's going to pay for that? So, having a cost benefit analysis we were able to demonstrate right from the outset the savings across, or the benefits realisation, because I don't believe there's anything called savings in the NHS at all. The benefits realisation of running such a service could release within the boards, so that therefore individual MSK services, which include physios, could then actually have a much greater resource to do with what they wished locally. So for me, it was a win-win. But interestingly enough, I was challenged unbelievably about that report, and including by our professional body, and the basis for the report was very sound. And that's why I commissioned the best health economist, because I knew that it would be challenged. And at the basis of all of that was people could not read into it properly what the key messages were. Now, one could argue maybe that's partly our fault in terms of what we were saying, but I suppose we have to accept some of that. But I think fundamentally at the bottom of that somebody read into this: if Scotland can save 5 million or release £5 million worth of physio resource as a consequence of this service, imagine that in England that's 10 times as much. It's 50 million. So somebody's going to take 50 million out of physio budgets. And actually that was not the issue at all. The people were comparing apples and pears and adding 2 and 2 and getting 46. And not stopping and actually looking at what the opportunities cost associated with this could be. And then I suppose that comes down to, for me, is services and service leaders across the NHS, across the UK, if I'm honest, are variable in terms of their abilities and their ability to see opportunities and to also represent their services to the best degree. And that is not of everybody's. It's not of everybody's making. I think that there's a lot of development and training that could actually go on to help people. But helping people, how many people can write a good service specification or a good business case, and that is critical to survival in this day and age. So what they could have done was use our cost benefits report and actually used it to the good, instead of thinking somebody's just going to hit me over the head with this and take away my money, physios will lose jobs, because that's not what it was saying at all. It was talking about services to patients and opportunities for services to have extra capacity released at a local level. And it's how you manage those messages. I think that locally is really key to developing services in the best way going forward.
I think it'd almost be a bit too softball for me, and you'd find it too easy if I was to simply try to present those arguments, because you've heard them so many times and almost you've just already baked in the answers to what you've said there as to why that wasn't the case. But so instead of doing that, if I can then almost infer that there is almost a conspiracy theory that comes for the ride on these things a little bit. So let's stick with this, with telehealth and some of the online digital platforming that gives patients access that is different to a traditional one-to-one, join the queue in a waiting room type issue. And really, when I talk about, say, conspiracy theory, is that it's almost that people can jump to conclusions so easily on the fact that this is simply a strategy, be that political or otherwise, to do people out of employment and simply use robots, for want of a better term, to undermine the human interface, and that these things can be systematized and commoditized and things. That it's almost that people, it goes beyond reason quite quickly in some ways, because people are so, they see it as being part of a wider agenda. Now, again, I keep inviting it, but you can tell me where I might be wrong on it. But if that is part of it, how do you reason with the unreasonable in that direction? Because I've witnessed that several times where people are just inferring malicious motives, where sometimes I know they don't exist, because I'm what are the, if I know when a conspiracy theory is wrong when I'm supposedly at the head of a conspiracy. So I don't know if you've been in those circumstances, and if so, what's the angle for trying to change those minds?
No, I think you've captured that really well there, Jack. I mean, I think fundamentally at the nub of all this again is people's insecurities. It's about perhaps ignorance, about not understanding, but also it's about thinking that, if you're going to use any digital, technological or e-health, telehealth product, that replaces you, and that is not the case. But if I went to every physio service or MSK service in this country and said, oh, so I presume that you don't have any waiting times or people waiting to see you, or you don't have this and you don't have that, I'm sure that I would get a really big pushback on that. So the way I look at it is we need to be embracing modern technology technology. One, because that's how we live the rest of our lives. That's how the people who use our services lead their lives and actually want to use access health and care. So why should we just put our heads in the sand and just say, well, this is the way we do it, and we're just ignoring what your expectation and wants and needs are? But equally so, it's often about, I think, a lack of confidence, or as I said, an understanding in one, how to use telehealth and telecare effectively. And it's certainly not about replacing anybody. And I defy anybody to come back and give me a business case that if you introduce a load of telehealth services, then actually I can lay off 10 people, because it doesn't work like that at all. It's about better productivity. The sad fact in today's NHS, the funding model today is lower than it was in 2008. When you look at inflation, etc., and it's not going to increase again until 2025. So therefore, we have to, it's incumbent on us to actually look at looking at different ways to actually be more cost effective. A good example I can give you is a colleague of mine who is a manager of a podiatry service, which is the biggest one in the UK. He's sort of very forward-thinking and innovative in his own right. But he introduced a change to his service whereby all of his 700 staff on every afternoon after 3:00 do not see anybody face to face, and they all get on the telephones, get on Skype, get on anything they want to actually engage with patients. And he had phenomenal resistance to that initially, but now most of them love it. Even the real resistors are begrudgingly saying, yeah, it's working. And the impact on service delivery has been phenomenal. Their waiting times have come down. And what's more importantly, the people who are using their services just love it, because it's much easier to factor in a phone call to somebody than drag yourself off to a clinic, possibly unnecessarily, if it's just something you can deal with over the phone or Skype, or you can send photos. But he's actually re-engineered his whole service to be able to deliver in that kind of mode. Now, that's just using things that everybody has at their disposal. It's not fancy tech and everything else. And it's just about being creative in order to meet, your service users' wants and needs, and also to drive efficiencies in your own service. So, it is a real problem. And there's not one answer to any of this. But I think or fundamentally, we've got to really sort of win hearts and minds over this. It requires lots and lots of messaging. We've got to get our colleagues and our fellow clinicians actually understanding the benefits, the real benefits, not only to their patients and the service, but to themselves as well. I know it's a different kind of example, but I know speech and language therapy services now who do all their sort of therapy via video conferencing, because they've been able to research trial allowed which monitored the outcomes of this. Actually found that they have better outcomes when they're not face to face with people, let alone all the efficiencies they are able to accrue from lack of travelling and all that, for example. Now, I'm not suggesting we go down that line, and physiotherapists actually are people who are trained and love to put their hands on people, and that must never ever stop. But they only need to put their hands on the people who need to have their hands on.
Yeah, otherwise, it's about putting your hands on people that don't need it, then it starts to creep into weird stuff there. Absolutely, you need to make sure that you divvy it up properly. That's speech and language example that you're using there. I spoke at a digital health conference a couple of years ago now, organised by Naomi McVeigh. And just some examples there that you've just reminded me of, where they'd found that they actually got optimized some of the results, especially with those with speech and language problems rather than swallow problems. in part because the fact that it decreased the patient's anxieties around the being in person. The interface of the phone which they were FaceTiming someone on was a more comfortable process for them than doing it face to face, and the social anxieties that came from having to get on the bus and get to where they were. And it just goes to show that it doesn't do the classic thing that people decide to strawman it with, which is that it waters down good care, which is always the obvious claim, the go-to slur, as it were, against these technologies, when actually it can be the quite the opposite. And you're advocating a sort of multi-dimensional approach rather than a replacement one, and that's a key distinction where you're busting myths as you go, which I think is just exactly the way to do it. You're a physio by training, but you now work in policy at the highest level, and we've talked a little bit about your journey to do so. Can I therefore ask your opinion as how our profession looks from the outside, which I know sounds a bit funny because, of course, you're not from the outside and you've kept close ties, but if you can give a take on that perception, if you would.
I think my honest answer is, if you like, I'll start by couching in a caveat. So I'm making generalities here. I know some fantastic services locally. I know some fantastic physios. I've got some great mates who are physios. However, I think, quite honestly, the perception of physiotherapy, if you like, from the outside in, is variable. And even I'll go as far to say it's pretty invisible at national level. So when I'm talking about national level, when the great and the good are sitting around the table deliberating what strategies need to be put in place to deal with whatever, you will very seldom ever see a physiotherapist as part of that discussion group. Which is a great shame. And the other thing I was thinking about is in the last 30 years that I know, how many physiotherapists actually sit on boards of management of healthcare organisations throughout this country? And I would suspect very, very few, and possibly less than I could count one of my hands. And again, that's to me is disappointing, that we have not been able to extend our spheres of influence to that level, and sometimes it is that level. That's disappointing. I'm not always convinced that, if I'm probably going to contradict myself, that we need to always be there. But what we do need is to have the ear and the confidence and the patronage, for want of a better word, of people who are there. And that's one of the things I don't think traditionally and even currently we're that good at as a profession. We tend to be a bit insular, isolated from everybody else. We have good relationships with people on personal levels, or at that level, but I'm not convinced that we're really good interdisciplinary team players. And when I say this, I'll probably get hate mail for it, but I think a lot of NHS physio services, have a sort of a feeling of superiority about them, which I think is unjustified, and they need to be better team players and to actually be able to articulate much better about the contribution they can make, but not just physiotherapy. It's physiotherapy as part of something else, because it's very seldom that we are the only profession that can impact on the outcome of somebody, and I think we have to recognise that. So I don't know. I think the key issue is that if you asked many outside the profession, and that includes people in the street, I'm not convinced that many people know exactly what physio is and does and can contribute, and what its value is. So there's something really worrying about that to me, and for that to change, we need one of the current buzzwords is leadership and influence at the highest level. And I know there are great efforts going on around the place. I'm not tarring everything with the same brush, but if we are to be thought of within some of those inner sanctums, then we have to work our game a little in terms of how we put ourselves across into being a credible and a profession that actually is worth investing in. Because without a doubt, we're in times of financial constraint. And it's really dangerous, to be in a position where you don't have influence at the highest level. So I think those are my primary observations about it. It doesn't sound very positive, does it?
Yeah, it doesn't need to be. We can drive some optimism towards the tail of the conversation, because I know that you do have some rosier points of view on certain things if we can get our act together. But it's a big if. Now, I think, whilst I really recognise that, and the listeners will understand the fact that's they can probably tell I've been sat there with a big grin, because it certainly maps onto my experiences. But I'm a skeptic for how we can change that in one way, really, which is that when criticisms of such as what you've just described there are heard to be talking the profession down in such a way. So I have been in a situation where I feel like it's only a way of strengthening our position is in order. The process of self improvement is to reflect, is to adapt, is to improve, is to be brutal where required, and to get our house in order is something that I've talked about from very early podcasts, and most guests have too. But then is also, we've been known as a show and as an enterprise, in a sense, as my business, as well as then the big R's that we've then grown into and worked on, is that all of these processes, to some people's taste, is simply being heretics and aren't necessarily in a situation. It's almost seen as being a militant talking down of the profession, and that's a thing that I continue to struggle to cleave myself off from that reputation. Now, whilst I don't want to seem like I'm asking you to counsel me as an individual on it, but it sounds like me, you, and others have had this experience where physiotherapy as a profession and generally as a part of an industry, we keep encountering that situation where there doesn't seem to be a lot of room to be critical without being considered to have either, as I mentioned before, a malicious agenda, or at best be in a situation where it's like, oh, don't say that, it might make us look bad, rather than think, wow, if we act on that, won't it make us look good? And I personally can't comprehend how narrow that space is, and I don't toe that line especially well.
All you've said, it completely resonates with me there. And as I say, if I were, I've probably been critical of my profession, but equally so, I belong to this profession. I still contribute to this profession. So I feel I'm entitled to have that view, and I've never shied away from it either. But equally so, it is a really difficult job. And as you say, you don't want to be seen to be doing the profession down, because at the end of the day, if we're going to change things around, what we want is an upbeat profession, people who really are committed and willing to take this agenda forward. So it's a difficult position to be in, but I don't think it's completely hopeless at all. There are ways around that, and so some of the conversations that you've been having through, I know equally so that they might have courted some controversy in some areas through the 3Rs, etc. But for me, what you have in that is a significant number of people who recognise some of the current limitations, and really are committed and one would hope brave enough to come together to have a collective voice to take things forward. But to me, the key will be in the collective voice. And the focus, the issue to me, and I've said this and given feedback to many of my physio and other allied health professionals, because it's not just a physio issue. I'm not just, physio bashing here. It affects many of the other allied health professions.
And just out of interest, do you think it might be there's an underlying ideological difficulty where people get tethered to. And I talked about this a little bit at the Big R's, and I don't know, some people seem to have liked it, and other people wanted me to clarify it a little in a bit more detail afterwards, which made me realise I probably could have worded it better. But what I was getting at with that is that compared to what I was calling the logical reasoning would be this concept in which you're trying to analyse the whole process and then trying to come up with the decisions and conclusions or whatever it be, rather than starting with the answer, because you're basing it on an ideological approach. Now, from what we're talking about a little bit, and we're trying to scratch our heads as to how we can best improve on things and try and take, the good and the great and good of the profession and try and prize it away from some of the Luddites and some of the sort of ways in which things have to be done because they've always been done. I just wondered if you've got a position on whether you feel that ideology does sit sometimes at the core of that. I've inferred in previous times and then explicitly said it in recent events where I think it does, and I think that that's an issue, and I find it really hard to deal with. Does that map onto what you're describing, and if so, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, undoubtedly. In terms of ideology, I feel that there is a theory called logic modelling, which I use a lot, and I think this really helps to, if you like, put issues or clarify issues that you're struggling with when you're not sure. Things need to get better, but you're sort of going round and round, the tumble dryer. And what logic modelling does, it actually sets out initially where it is you want to get to. So you've actually got a statement is this is what this needs to look like for whatever, and then what you do is you work backwards from that under certain headings, etc., and that then helps you to map out what it is you need to do to get to that end point. It's also really useful because as you start, you've got a way and a mean of actually reviewing yourself without getting too far down that road to actually ensure that you're doing the steps you've identified are the right steps to get where you need to be. So using IDs and ideals for me should always shape and drive a profession. So we need to know where we're getting to, and equally so, another way of looking at it is we need to know the problems that we can solve. And we need to set those out very clearly. Because again, I think this comes back to, if you like, some of my criticism points I made earlier of the profession. What I see is we're not good at is articulating how we can be the solution for other people's problems. We just set out and say, yes, we can do A, B, and C, but actually having, and this comes down as much to political savviness, is understanding that if the manager of a service or somebody else has got a problem because they've got 15,000 people on their waiting list with X problem. So, actually speaking their language and saying, well, we can solve your problem, or we can solve 60% of your problem for you, and this is how we can do it, is a lacking, I think, very much in our profession in terms of our approach. I know I've been, when we were at the 3Rs meeting quite recently in April, I was probably quite critical, and I think I actually used the words parochialist and a bit of protectionism about our profession. But that is my experience, and what that means to me, though, is we're not particularly risk averse. We are not comfortable with change or even open to the concept of change. But this issue about parochialism, we can't have it both ways. Again, coming back to my first point, if you're professional, you've got to strive for being better, and that does not involve being isolationist. So, we've got to provide the solutions to the problems that other people have, and that's where we will gain an enhanced credibility as a profession. And I think we need to think of it in those terms.
Yeah, so we need to make sure that we keep a way in which things can collide and clash and improve themselves through competition, and keep that conversation flowing. Which, of course, is obviously music to my ears. It's the how that sometimes we seem to get caught up on. Now, one of the ways in which I think that becomes a bit of a catch point for people is that people get demoralised by what and I said this at the big R's in what was I wouldn't even call it a clash, just a subtle disagreement between me and Steve Tolan, who's head of practice at the CSP, in which I then was saying I wanted to use the word bureaucracy, but I wasn't necessarily meaning it in a pejorative. It's more that when someone describes these are the ways to influence change, and then it just becomes massive jargon, and to some extent, even though I've thought in that direction as much as I physically can, it's still something that puts a sour taste in my mouth. And is that something that, it makes me reflect on the fact that is this something that I just I'm only scared of because I don't understand it, or is this something that actually is just a nasty web of bureaucracy that therefore can't be changed? And naturally, although I stop myself being, I can understand people tell me all the time that they are demoralised by the fact that these are it would take me to have a full-time job trying to instigate change to even understand the process of doing so. It is something that really intimidates people. Now, having spoken to you several times, I feel like you've got a slightly different take on the matter than saying, no, this is the way in which you've got to do it. You've got to, you've got to exert influence here, and here in order to unlock door B, which is still 6 years till you get to door C. And I just feel like you've helped to open my mind a little bit that doesn't always have to be the way, and you've demonstrated it through your career. So what would you say to those that reach out to me saying I'm demoralised at the fact that this process in which I'm told I have to exert change via is one that just doesn't resonate with me? Do you have any messages for those?
Well, first of all, I fully understand and empathise with anybody who sort of feels, well, I've tried to do this and I'm pushing on shut doors, but equally so, there are, you have to be a bit canny in your tactics around all this stuff, I think, and, you have to be a bit agile on your feet. There is no roadmap to follow that says do A, B, and C, and that this will be the outcome, and particularly when you're involving individuals, behaviours, and perhaps some entrenched attitudes and views and values. So, you just have to be able to think a bit on your feet. So interestingly, one of the questions I've often, when I've been talking to services and they, I can see they're doing some great stuff, or they're struggling with finalising the final hurdle to actually introduce some great stuff. And I've said, well, who have you told about this? And I said, well, how many of you, how many of these service leaders have actually just knocked on your chief exec's door and just had a chat with them? Or how many of you just phoned up the chief exec's office and said, we'd like to invite the chief exec down for coffee, and people are just aghast that I'm even suggesting such a thing. But actually, they're just people who are busy people, have got thousands of things on their agenda. Unless you push yourself onto that agenda, you will not get on that. Because we're a profession, we don't kill anybody. I think very seldom. Fortunately, it's not the nature of what we do and how we do things. So therefore, it's very easy for us to be invisible, as I'd said before about this cloak of invisibility. So you have to break through that by doing something different. And the biggest thing that can help you in overcoming change and also resistance in some areas, even within some of your colleagues, etc., is to have those critical friends. And I've always worked on the premise you go for the highest one you can get. If go for your chief exec, and don't think the chief exec's not interested, because I know many chief execs and they would love to know what's going on there, or they can smooth the way or open some other doors. And particularly in the world that I'm involved in at the moment in digital stuff, we have a national leadership programme here in Scotland, and we've put 100 people through it so far. And as part of this, we've been doing it for 4 years, and they're quite senior in their own right, but a lot of them, when they're doing their piece of work they have to do for this master's programme, really run up against a major blockage and a barrier in making this thing that they've identified work. And, but we have a mentoring programme, and often it's just some advice about who to go and see. And actually, you don't need to be bothering with them. You go and see that person or speak to that person, and they will unlock those doors. So, my sort of experience and chats with everybody else is that, it can be completely debilitating and wearisome, and you just want to just leave the room, really. But, stop before it gets to that stage and actually think, who are my critical friends? Have I got the right critical friends, the people who can open doors for me? And it's, and again, it comes back to this bit about parochialism for physios. I don't think they're good at actually acknowledging that somebody else can help them, and they need the help of that somebody else to actually open that door. And it will be their own merit that actually gets them through there and they don't get booted out the room the other side. But we all need a helping hand, and don't be frightened of go to your chief exec, go to your medical director, go to your nursing director, because those are the people who can often untangle things for you. And just suck it up, and we can't do everything on our own.
But I've got to ask. I mean, whilst it's great and it tickles me because, of course, I think we know each other enough to know that would be my style too. But it's the gasps in which I've literally encountered as to the way in which I use language when in the presence of the trust hierarchy and royalty that's often perceived is, I've been reprimanded historically for that's just not how you speak when the chief exec's here. Yet, despite receiving an email within hours from the chief exec thanking me for my candidness, it's just a bit bizarre. So I have to ask you, what is it that's driving that? Because I recognise it, don't get me wrong, but what's driving that stoicism, that conservatism, that way in which the profession, again, to stereotype, and it's unfair to say it's all, but what is going on for me to be chuckling, just recognising exactly what you're describing and being in a situation where I can't pretend I'm seeing it on the turn. I see that as much now as I did 10 years ago when I got into the practice. It's like it sort of worries me that I can see that so clearly as much now as I could 10 years ago. Do you have any sort of take on what that is, why it is at the core of our profession?
Well, I think it's a long-standing historical issue. I think it's built on sort of hierarchies and perceived hierarchies, and knowing your own place, etc., etc. And I would say to anybody, just wipe that away. And I've always wiped it away. I think it's the way you do it, and it's the way you approach people. And it's this issue about asking for assistance, but also providing potential solutions. And nobody should feel that they can't go and speak to anybody about any of this. It doesn't matter what band or grade you are, etc. And definitely our service leaders should be doing it on a daily basis, because how can you ever the NHS is an appalling, the difficult sort of organisation to actually navigate and get your way through. You need all the help you can get, and I don't believe in any of that at all. I think it stems from people's views that you could only speak up at certain times. And I always encouraged any of my staff or anybody I know is, everybody wants to do the best they can. 99.9% of people in the NHS are there to make a difference, and absolutely welcome the opportunity to have a discussion with absolutely anybody who can make that happen. So yeah, it's about sort of growing a thick skin. And if somebody says to you that's not the right thing to say, then I would just ignore that, because you've got the evidence that it has had the impact. And it's not about going and whinging about everything. It's about going and putting forward a positive solution. And it might be a positive solution to a problem everybody's whinging about, but it's how you actually approach the providing that solution that everybody's looking for.
Yeah, a bit of bravery goes a long way in that direction, doesn't it? So no, I do agree. As we're trying to discuss and instigate change on a variety of levels with the big R's, and the movement is spending time both on grassroots level issues and systems policy level issues. And so, whilst my it's like kind of comes from my general ethos of read all the books, have all the conversations, sort of broad brush liberal as I am, I guess I wondered if you've a take on where you feel our emphasis should be and where you feel we would be most effective. Because like everything, like any project, like any team, we have a bandwidth issue. We have an upper limit of time and resources in which we can achieve things. Do you have a take on where we should maybe be concentrating our efforts?
Yes, I do. All the established improvement science, which includes change management sort of theory, etc., is very clear that you can. It doesn't matter what everybody says at the top, unless you win the hearts and minds of the at grassroots, you're never going to get a change implemented through. So the grassroots is really important. And it's this whole business of winning hearts and minds. And, if we're brutally honest, what's in it for me? Why should I change? It's about being very clear about what the benefits are. And it comes back to, I think, without wanting to sound like a broken record, for me, the 3 Rs is a fantastic opportunity. The thing it needs to be able to do next is really articulate what the vision is. So, what is it that the 3 Rs would love to see in terms of musculoskeletal services? And that, again, and I think sometimes perhaps that logic modelling approach really helps with that. So, setting out what is it at the end of the day that we're obviously trying to change a variety of things, but with a purpose. So really setting out clearly what the purpose is and being aspirational. And it doesn't matter if it's quite visionary, because I think sometimes those are really the things that get people going. And then translating it back. So grassroots is essential. But to achieve that in a profession of such a size, and obviously diversity and the geographical issues, is going to be quite a challenge in itself. So therefore, it needs to lead by example, and to have some real champions who are then demonstrating impact and value and worth. And as I say, that key thing is what's in it for the individual. Why should they even think about changing anything they're doing? And so that is critical, and that is really important. To have the groundswell of early adopters, as we talked about before, and reaching that tipping point. But you do need efforts at all levels, and it's critical to include the system leaders. But to me, it's all about the message. And again, what is it? What is that Potter, that Nirvana thing at the end of the rainbow that we're trying to get to? And if we can be very clear about that, and I think we could, then it's relatively, and I use that word very carefully, it's relatively simple to map out then the steps of who, when you need to get people on board from that, working backwards. But every level needs to be involved, and I appreciate what you're saying, because a lot of people are giving of their time, effort, and will to do this, and there isn't the capacity really in the system to achieve all of that. So we have to grow the capacity to be able to do that.
It's the various hooks, isn't it? Like having different hooks for different tastes, for want of a better term, in order to help people to recognise that this is something that does benefit all if we can get the vision right. So definitely some more stuff to come on that. And fortunately, although you certainly, as ever, have sort of taught me as to things there that are directions of travel and advice that I can try and take forward for how to lead this thing, but also various things that you've described there that did emerge from the last event and the summary that people pulled together. It kind of points us towards that, trying to find ways to demonstrate what we're calling blueprints of practice and example pieces, and getting these champions on board for each of what we've had as tables at the events, and what building a wider network that resonates within this community approach that we're trying to embed within the website. So that's been great advice, and certainly something that I think some of it we're on the right lines for, but as ever we're changing. It's been a funny thing because we've tried to balance out having the conversation like a broad analysis of where are the problems emerging, and then this is now getting into the meat on the bones of what is the solution that we're proposing, what are we getting at here, and that's certainly what is most exciting right now. It brings me then to what is sort of a summary question, or a couple of questions, which is, well, are you optimistic about the future is the first part, and then if so or if not, what conditions lead to positive and negative outcomes when we're thinking forward about not just the profession but the people we're trying to help, of course, the patients and the MSK services and things like that.
Well, if I think, am I optimistic about the future in terms of, is that a very specific question in relation to what exactly?
Good point. Good point. Yeah, as it stands, thinking about what you've spent your career championing for, improvements of systems of patient care, of management, of reducing things like waiting times that we know disable people. If you think about all the things that have got you out of bed in the morning and been causes that you've championed, are you when you look into a crystal ball, do you think you're going to see your visions enacted, or are you more pessimistic that we might fall short as a current level, I suppose, a current trend, if we call it that?
I think within the digital sphere, I think the next 5 years we will see a phenomenal. We'll see a phenomenal acceleration of the whole agenda, and I think that's right across the UK. Because I think they've realised that they've cottoned onto this. This is make or break for the NHS. I'm talking about here. There's a long-term strategy. They've lagged behind the investment and the upskilling of the workforce to date. And I can see that within the intended plans, if they materialise, then this whole agenda is going to accelerate at pace and at scale. So in some respects, I'm really optimistic about that. What I'm slightly more sitting on the fence about is, am I confident that my profession and some others will really embrace the opportunities afforded by that? I'm still slightly unsure. I think they will be embraced in some areas, but really I'd love to see them being collectively embraced. So again, we come back to, the profession itself has to really understand that it needs to be really agile and forward thinking, and really demonstrate that it wants to work with others around all of this. So yes, my sphere in digital world, I think that physios and others could really get up the middle of that, and I think it could really make a big impact on the service, the shape and the form of our current service delivery that we would all benefit from, let alone our users, the users of our services who should be at the centre of all this, really. But equally so, I suppose my sort of wobbly bit around my optimism, I am a half full person by nature, but my sort of wobbly bit was, am I convinced that as a collective we're brave enough and we're clear about how we can make that contribution? I'm not sure, and I think we're going to have to do it really quickly if we're not going to be left behind. So a mixed bag of answers to your question.
No, I think that's fair enough. Yeah, you're sort of describing the fact that you feel there's an inevitable trend of progress, which would obviously suit you in many ways and suit therefore the world, if we call it that. But then you're less sure as to whether we'll be in the right vehicle to be part of that change, and I think that's a really interesting point. Can I press you a little bit more on the conditions then, as to what might then potentially lead to a negative outcome if we stick with that for physiotherapists within it? So how might we end up just not taking that mantle, and is it that on the current trend of progress, unless something changes, and I don't know the degrees of sort of how radically it would need to change is obviously the difficulty. We struggle to know exactly what pace is perfect, and then on the reverse, what are the conditions that would lead to us sleepwalking into obscurity, is often the term used.
I think we need more physios I think it's a few things. I think we need more physios really engaged at high levels in these agendas, so that they are there, and just by being there and contributing and talking about their contribution, I think that would make a phenomenal difference. With the new digital health strategy in England that was published last year, a good example of this is they've established a digital leadership academy. Now, I have seen the list of people who are in the first cohort of this, and I can't recognise a physio in that. And this is the highest level. There's about 100 places, and we have in Scotland we have I think 10 of those places. Now, all the people that have gone on it from Scotland, bar one, are medics. So next time round, and I played a game like this. I didn't place one of my profession into that cohort for a very good reason, but next time round I will be doing. But I would love to be assured that just as an example, that physios are getting involved with things at that level. They're not just going on physiotherapy leadership stuff. They are going into multidisciplinary fora under the things that are really the big ticket agenda items at the moment. And I think the more people that we can get in those positions, they're a different agenda. I'm just using digital as an example. The improvement agenda is the other really big, and improvement patient safety is the really big agenda in town. And then you have access to all the the leaders, the system leaders, the thought thinkers, the people who are actually writing the stuff down that we're going to be doing for the next 10 years or so. And until we have that, we're never going to be at the table at the party, really, and we'll be very much reliant on the scraps that somebody else throws to us if they have the wherewithal to do that. So I would like to see many more. So in terms of the conditions there, the conditions would be that physiotherapists have the opportunity and are encouraged and actually take the place. If nobody offers it to you, you've got to stand up and make your case known. So take these opportunities, take the national opportunities that at all levels, actually. You don't have to be very, very, very senior. There are lots of opportunities for physios to go and see what is the National Improvement Academy doing, how can I get involved in that, what's happening around the digital space, etc., and really get involved in that. So, but if we don't take these opportunities, then we will not have any credible influence, and as you say, we'll be more and more invisible, and that's the worrying thing for me. I'm talking about the NHS. I know some fantastic examples of organisations who've got it and understand all this stuff and are moving into this space, and good for them, because it's too dangerous a game. It's to be playing, to be risking it all in that way. So the conditions that you need for success are quite diverse and variable, but the key thing for me is you've got to recognise those conditions and you've got to seize the opportunity. So when something comes along, just make sure you seize it. Get your staff involved, or do it yourself. Or if you can't see it, go and find it.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting the sort of the conditions that could lead to a negative outcome are simply a failure to embrace the positives that are there, and they're also really well funded opportunities, aren't they, in that space? I mean, I think people are often here on the podcast where I might ask a question like that to a clinical academic or someone that's been heavily involved in research, be that of a specific body part or otherwise. And they'll often, if I ask a question in that direction, they'll suggest something like, we need people to just have the uptake and get involved in research doctorates and to MScs and to become more numerate and things like that. And then the answer often comes from our listenership about the fact that that's a nice idea, Jack, but funding this and trying to find a way to bring that in terms of time, which I completely sympathise with, and whether or not it's a worthwhile investment is often a snag that we come across. Whereas in this circumstance, this is something that is there's some real great funds and resources and personnel in that space in which opportunities are knocking all the time that aren't costly. Of course, you've got to invest the time and make the effort. But certainly, if finances was a snag in these circumstances, from what I've experienced, these are very well funded opportunities that people should embrace. And of course, in our show notes and the like, and on social media, we will link you to some examples of that if you are interested in that, because of course the Physio Matters listeners are exactly the hot property that those people want to hear from, as biased as I am. But that's brilliant. Just to summarise then, Lesley, you will be involved in our Big R's conference, Reforming MSK Practice, come October. And so I suppose I shouldn't make the assumption that you've enjoyed it so far, but what do you think it is that about the Big R's process that you've embraced, and why you've been a supporter of it? And then what is it about the conference that maybe that you think will help us to move forward with?
Well, my reason for supporting it is it so resonated with me about a couple of other initiatives that I've been involved in over the years that have been really successful, and if you like, the conditions that were created for that success, I see very much the opportunities there with the 3Rs. So you have really good leadership. So good on you guys there, Jack and the others. You have people who are willing to put themselves out there, galvanise others, organise others, etc. But nothing will be pivotal just around that. It was the fact that there were so many people in that room who were there for a collective and well. They all had a collective reason for being there, and I thought that was such an important and positive start. And the key for me is that these people, and there's some really great and goods in MSK services who are there, and what that tells me is they care and they've got passion, and it's really what we need now is to channel that into some key deliverables, some key visions, so that everybody's agreed on board what it is we're trying to do, and it's much easier to work from there. But we have the opportunity to really, we know what the problems are across the country in terms of these services, but we really have an opportunity through this, and I really thank you and also Connect for, actually providing the opportunity for people to come together, because that's often all it needs, just to spark that idea. If you don't know, I'll send you the link and you can put it up there. There's a fantastic video on YouTube, which I do use quite a bit actually in my work, which is of a guy. It's called the dancing guy. I don't know if you've seen it.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Have you seen that one?
Uh-huh.
And actually, this is about creating social movement. Whatever you call it, it's a social movement, and it's a movement for change. And there are certain criteria you need to fulfill. And the dancing guy video tells you exactly what you need. Mm-hmm. And that's what we need to do.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a great way to finish, and it'll be a fun clip. We will definitely be sharing that, and I think that's great. Once again, thank you so much for your time, and a huge inspiration I'm sure you'll be to our listeners. And thank you once again for supporting what we're doing with the Big R's and beyond, especially for the conference, and just trying to make sure that we take this groundswell of interest and motivation that people have to take that to a broader audience, and try and get as many people as we can involved in that, which is an open access and accessible conference that we're doing 5th and 6th of October, in which of course Lesley will be front and centre. We'll get her views, and especially in panel formats, I think she thrives, and you'll see that on the live streams, and certainly you'll be seeing as we make public the feedback from those panel discussions at the last Big R's event. Lesley was certainly someone who resonated with our audience, and inevitably will do with you guys too. So once again, thank you so much, Lesley. I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
No, thank you. It's been an absolute delight. Well done.
And that was session 54. Thanks a lot for listening. Thank you so much to Lesley for her time, really valuable time, and certainly, as you've heard, a very busy and important lady. So incredible that she's paying attention to what we're doing and supporting what we're doing. Certainly want to be listening to her on the panels at the conference. But we've got a nice balance, really, of sort of patient stuff, as you heard on the podcast before this one. We're gonna have sort of policy analysts such as Lesley, but also who keep her ear right to the ground on the front frontline issues that physiotherapists face, and then there's a lot of more clinical stuff and sort of reforming exercise stream. We've got reforming clinical research stream, working on education, talking with students and things like that. And then also there's going to be some deep dives into manual therapy with Dr. Neil Langridge. Reforming manual therapy is going to be an interesting session, keynote followed by a panel discussion and debate, Q&A, really getting you guys involved. There's also some smaller workshop formats where we break into side rooms. As you noticed at the top of the show, I'm rather excited. I could talk about this conference all the time, but what I'm most mortified at is that there's going to be people that miss out on tickets if they don't pull their finger out. So www.reform.physio/conference. Click through that, really simple interface, get yourself booked. If you've been sent there by someone, make sure you put their name in there. They get some beer vouchers for the party and everyone's happy. Sign up for our show notes newsletter on the website choosehealth.co.uk to get all the details of the policies and processes discussed in this podcast, and a regular newsletter and access to our Google Drive page, which has all of the resources from every podcast we've ever touched and all the full text articles you could ever need. If you haven't already, and we know that some of you have because we've been getting some feedback about it, exerciseprescriber.com for all of your exercise prescribing needs. They're a brilliant company, incredibly supportive of what we're doing and clear innovators in that field. So make sure you sign up for them, and thank you so much to them for sponsoring our episodes. Then to the usual, I'm at Jack A. Chew on Twitter. At TPM Podcast is where the main feed is for this podcast. You then find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and of course the newsletter as I've just described it. We're making lots of noise. We will be doing so in more events coming soon, including the conference. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your support. Keep your feedback coming in. Keep the conversation going on and offline, and we'll speak to you soon. I forgot to ask Lesley to do our cheesy sign out, so I'll do the honours and tell you that you've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast, discussing physio matters because physio matters. Bye for now.